A new face in the market. The intergalactic market was alive with sound and motion. Merchants shouted over one another, advertising rare wares from distant planets. Strange smells, a mix of exotic spices and metallic tang, filled the air. Brightly colored lights flickered from stalls, casting shifting shadows across the crowd of aliens moving through the narrow paths. Every species imaginable seemed to be present. Towering creatures with scales, tiny beings with fur, and floating forms with glowing orbs for eyes. In the middle of the chaos, a tiny alien girl stood alone. She was no taller than a human child, with pale green skin and large watery eyes that darted nervously around. She clutched a small, tattered satchel tightly against her chest, her thin fingers trembling. Her name was Zira, and she didn't belong here. Zira glanced around, trying to look inconspicuous, but her fear was obvious. Her antennae twitched at every loud noise, and she flinched whenever someone brushed past her. She was searching for something or someone. Her heart pounded as she stepped closer to a food stall, her stomach growling. The scent of roasted meat made her dizzy with hunger. "Get lost if you're not buying," growled the stall owner, a grumpy, six-eyed alien with horns. Zira quickly stepped back, her face flushing with embarrassment. She didn't have any money, just a small device tucked in her satchel, a clue to her brother's last location. But the device was old and nearly broken, and she had no idea how to fix it. As she turned to leave, her foot caught on a loose stone, and she stumbled forward, colliding with a towering alien thug. The thug was massive, with gray, rock-like skin and arms as thick as tree trunks. His glowing red eyes glared down at her as she fell to the ground, spilling the contents of her satchel. "Watch where you're going, runt," the thug bellowed, his voice deep and menacing. Zira scrambled to gather her things, her hands shaking. The small device from her satchel landed near the thug's foot. He picked it up, examining it with a cruel smirk. "What's this junk? Doesn't look like it's worth anything," he sneered, holding it out of Zira's reach as she tried to grab it. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's mine. Give it back." The thug laughed, a booming sound that drew the attention of nearby shoppers. They stopped to watch, their expressions a mix of curiosity and pity. No one dared to intervene. The thug was known for his temper, and no one wanted to risk his wrath. "You want it? Come and take it, little bug," he mocked, holding the device higher. Zira's eyes filled with tears, but she stood frozen, too afraid to move. Then, a calm voice cut through the tension. She said, "It's hers. Give it back." The crowd turned to see who had spoken. A human stepped forward, his hands in the pockets of his worn leather jacket. He wasn't particularly tall or muscular, but there was something about the way he carried himself. Steady, confident, and completely unafraid. The thug narrowed his eyes at the human. "And who do you think you are, Tiny? This isn't your business." The human shrugged, his expression neutral. "Maybe not, but I don't like bullies, especially ones who pick on someone smaller than them." The crowd murmured in disbelief. Humans were rare in this part of the galaxy, and most of them avoided trouble. But this one wasn't backing down. His piercing green eyes locked onto the thug's red ones, and for a moment, the air seemed to freeze. The thug laughed again, but it sounded less certain this time. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but guts won't save you." "Maybe not," the human replied, his voice steady. "But they'll make you look pretty stupid when you pick a fight with the wrong guy." The thug hesitated. The human wasn't backing down, and the crowd was starting to whisper. If he fought now and lost, it would hurt his reputation. With a growl, he tossed the device onto the ground at Zira's feet. "Not worth my time," he muttered, shoving past the human and disappearing into the crowd. The tension in the air eased as the crowd dispersed, returning to their business. The human knelt down and picked up the device, brushing off the dust before handing it to Zira. She stared at him, wide-eyed, as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. "You okay?" he asked gently, Zira nodded, clutching the device to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. The human smiled, his face softening. "Name's Jake. What's yours?" "Zira," she replied, her voice still shaky. "Well, Zira," Jake said, standing up. "Looks like you've had a rough day. Let's get out of here before that guy changes his mind." As they walked away from the market, Zira glanced up at Jake. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The human defender. Jake leaned casually against the edge of a weathered metal stall, his sharp green eyes watching the chaos of the market fade behind them. The tiny alien girl, Zira, shuffled nervously beside him, clutching her satchel as if it were her lifeline. She had barely spoken since the incident with the thug, her large, expressive eyes darting to him every few seconds, uncertain but curious. "So, Zira," Jake said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, like the low rumble of a distant engine. "What's a kid like you doing in a place like this? You don't exactly look like a local." Zira hesitated, her antennae twitching. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, but he had stepped in when no one else would. Finally, she whispered, "I'm Matt from here. I'm looking for someone." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, whoever you're looking for landed you in trouble with Mr. Angry back there." Her grip on the satchel tightened, and she looked down at her feet. "I'm looking for my brother. He disappeared a few cycles ago. I heard rumors he was taken by someone bad." Jake nodded, his expression unreadable. "This someone bad got a name?" Zira's voice dropped even lower, as if the name itself carried weight. "The Iron Fang Gang." Jake let out a low whistle. "Figures. Those guys are trouble, no matter what sector you're in. How'd your brother end up on their radar?" He's smart," Zira said, a flicker of pride in her voice. "He could fix anything. Machines, ships, anything broken. But people like him get noticed. The wrong kind of noticed." Jake rubbed the stubble on his chin, his mind working through the implications. "And you've been chasing after him all by yourself." She nodded, and Jake sighed. "Well, I got to say, you've got guts. But guts don't count for much if you get yourself killed. Those guys don't play fair." Zira looked up at him, her eyes wide with desperation. "I don't have a choice. He's all I have left." Jake held her gaze for a moment, then crossed his arms. "Look, I'm no hero, but you're not getting far on your own. If you want to find your brother, you're going to need someone who knows how to navigate this kind of mess." Her antennae perked up slightly. "You mean, you'll help me?" Jake shrugged. "I don't like bullies, remember? And I've had my fair share of run-ins with gangs like the Iron Fang. Let's just say I know how to handle myself." For the first time, Zira allowed herself a small smile. It was fleeting, but it was there, like a crack of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Jake said, his tone turning serious. "If we're going to do this, we need a plan. These guys aren't the type to leave breadcrumbs. They'll cover their tracks and bury anyone who tries to dig too deep." Zira nodded eagerly. "I'll do whatever it takes." Jake smirked. "Good. First things first, we're going to need information. And I know just the place to start." The bar was dimly lit and smelled like a mix of stale alcohol and engine grease. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on a tourist brochure, but it was perfect for their needs. The patrons were rough, their conversations low and tense. A holographic jukebox hummed in the corner, playing a song that no one seemed to care about. Jake pushed the door open and stepped inside, Zira trailing behind him like a shadow. She stuck close, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Jake leaned down and whispered, "Relax. If you look scared, they'll smell it from across the room." Zira swallowed hard and straightened her posture, though her antennae betrayed her unease. Jake led her to a corner booth, far enough from the bar to avoid prying ears, but close enough to keep an eye on the exits. A server, A thin, insectoid alien with glimmering wings buzzed over to take their order. 2 synth brews, Jake said, sliding a few credits across the table. The server clicked in acknowledgement and buzzed away. "What are we doing here?" Zira whispered. "Listening," Jake replied, scanning the room. "Places like this are crawling with information. All you have to do is know where to look." As the drinks arrived, Jake's gaze settled on a group of shady characters near the bar. One of them, a lizard-like alien with cybernetic implants, was speaking in hushed tones, but Jake's trained ears caught snippets of the conversation. "Shipment from the Iron Fang. Tight security. No outsiders." Jake leaned toward Zira. "Bingo. Looks like our friends are making moves." Zira's eyes widened. "What do we do?" Jake smiled, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. "We follow the trail. And if they don't want to tell us what we need to know, we'll make them." The scene was set. The stakes were high, and as Jake and Zira prepared to step further into danger, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning. The alien girl's story. The neon lights of the bustling intergalactic city flickered outside the small, dimly lit room Jake had rented for the night. Zira sat cross-legged on the worn couch, clutching her satchel as if it were a shield. The room was simple, a single bed pushed against the wall, a rickety table, and a cracked monitor flickering with static. Jake leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, studying her with a quiet intensity. "All right, kid," he said, breaking the silence. "If we're going to take on a gang like the Iron Fang, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Start from the beginning." Zira hesitated, her antennae drooping slightly. She wasn't used to talking about herself, especially not with strangers. But Jake had saved her, stood up for her when no one else would. She owed him that much. Taking a deep breath, she began. "My brother's name is Rin," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Back on our home planet, we didn't have much. Just a little workshop where Rin fixed things for people. Tools, machines, even old droids. He was brilliant. Everyone said so." Jake nodded, motioning for her to continue. "Things were hard after the war started," she said, her eyes distant. "Our city was destroyed, and we lost everything. But Ren never gave up. He kept us going, even when we had to live in the ruins. He found scraps and turned them into something useful. That's just who he was." Her voice wavered slightly, and she paused to collect herself. Jake waited patiently, not interrupting. "One day," she continued, "a group of strangers came to our camp. They said they were merchants, offering food and supplies in exchange for repairs. Ren agreed to help them. But after he fixed their equipment, they took him." Jake's expression hardened. "The Iron Fang." Zira nodded, her large eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't know who they were at first. They said Rin had a gift, that he'd be wasted in a place like ours. I tried to stop them, but I was too small, too weak. They pushed me aside like I was nothing." Her hands clenched into fists, and her voice grew firmer. "They took him, and no one did anything. The others in the camp were too scared to stand up to them. So I left. I followed their trail, asking questions, trading what little I had for information. It led me here." Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You've been chasing them this whole time." "Yes," she said, determination burning in her voice. "I can't give up on him. He's all I have." Jake studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he walked over to the table and pulled out a small device, a portable holomap. He tapped on it, bringing up a three-dimensional projection of the city. "All right," he said, pointing to a section of the map. "If the Iron Fang is operating here, they're not just passing through. They've got a base, probably somewhere in the industrial district. That's where they do their dirty work, repairs, smuggling, and whatever else keeps their empire running." Zira leaned forward, her antennae perking up. "How do we find it?" Jake smirked. "That's the tricky part. Gangs like this don't advertise their locations, but they rely on informants and supply chains. We keep pressing the right people, and someone's bound to crack. Zira frowned. But what if they don't want to talk? The Iron Fang scares everyone. Jake's smirk widened. That's where I come in. I've got a way of persuading people. She tilted her head, curious. You mean fighting? Sometimes, he admitted. But usually, it's about knowing what to say, how to push their buttons. People like that thug back at the market. They're big and loud, but they're not used to someone standing up to them. Makes them nervous. Zira hesitated, then nodded. I don't know how to thank you for helping me. You don't even know me. Jake leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. I've been where you are, kid. Lost, scared, and desperate to save someone I cared about. If someone had helped me back then. He trailed off, his gaze distant for a moment before he shook his head. Let's just say I know what it's like to feel alone. Her antennae twitched, sensing the weight in his words. What happened to you? Jake looked at her, his jaw tightening slightly. Another time, matey. Right now, we've got work to do. Zira nodded, understanding. She didn't press him further. Jake stood, rolling up the holomap. First thing tomorrow, we hit the industrial district. We'll ask around, see if anyone knows where the Iron Fang is hiding. But you've got to be careful. These people are dangerous. I'm not afraid, Zira said, her voice steady. Jake chuckled. Good. Because once we're in, there's no turning back. As the lights of the city flickered outside, Zira felt a flicker of hope in her chest. For the first time since her brother was taken, she wasn't facing the darkness alone. She had an ally, someone who understood her pain and was willing to fight by her side. Tomorrow, they would begin their search. And no matter what stood in their way, Zira knew one thing. She wouldn't stop until she found her brother. And now she had Jake to help her make that promise a reality. Into the lion's den. The industrial district was a labyrinth of towering factories, rusting pipes, and dimly lit alleys. The air was heavy with the stench of chemicals and the low hum of machinery. Jake and Zira stood at the edge of the district, staring into the maze of shadows. The atmosphere was oppressive, the kind of place where bad things happened and no one asked questions. Jake adjusted the strap of his pack and glanced down at Zira. You ready for this, kid? She nodded, her antennae twitching nervously. I've been ready since the day they took Rin. Jake gave her a faint smirk. Good answer. Just remember, stay close to me, keep your head down, and don't trust anyone. The people here will sell you out for a handful of credits if they think it'll save their skin. Zira swallowed hard but nodded again. She tightened her grip on her satchel, the small device inside giving her a sense of security. It was the last connection she had to her brother, and she wasn't going to lose it again. As they moved deeper into the district, the sounds of hissing steam and grinding metal grew louder. Jake led the way, his movements smooth and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Zira followed closely, her wide eyes scanning every shadow for signs of danger. Jake suddenly stopped, holding up a hand. See that building over there? He whispered, pointing to a squat, windowless structure with a flickering red light above the door. That's where the Iron Fang's informants hang out. We're going to start there. Zira frowned. How do you know? Jake grinned. Places like this all have the same stink. Trust me, I've been around. They approached the building cautiously. Jake pushed the door open, and a wave of stale air hit them. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with a few scattered tables and a long counter at the back. The patrons were a rough-looking crowd, scarred faces, cybernetic limbs, and eyes that flicked toward the newcomers with suspicion. Jake strode in like he owned the place, his boots clicking against the metal floor. Zira followed, trying to make herself as small as possible. They found a table near the back, and Jake motioned for her to sit. Now, he said quietly, we wait. After a few minutes, a server approached their table, a lanky alien with gray skin and 4 arms. It clicked its mandibles and gestured toward the menu projected on its chest. Jake waved it off. "Not here to eat. I need information." The alien's mandibles clicked again, this time in irritation. "Information costs extra." Jake slid a handful of credits across the table. "Tell me about the Iron Fang." The alien froze, its compound eyes narrowing. "I don't know anything." Jake leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. "Come on. A place like this. You hear things. And I bet the Fang pays you well to keep quiet. But here's the thing. If you don't tell me what I want to know, I'll make sure they think you did. Imagine how that'll go over." The alien's mandibles clicked furiously, its body twitching with anxiety. "Fine. There's a warehouse, 2 blocks north. They use it to store their shipments. That's all I know." Jake leaned back, a satisfied smirk on his face. "See, that wasn't so hard." The alien scurried away, muttering under its breath. Zira watched it go, her antennae trembling. "That was intense." Jake shrugged. "People like that only respond to pressure. Now we got a lead." The warehouse was exactly where the server said it would be, a towering structure surrounded by high fences and patrolled by armed guards. Jake and Zira crouched behind a stack of crates, studying the layout. "There's no way we're walking through the front door," Jake muttered. "But places like this always have a back entrance." Zira's eyes scanned the building, and her antennae perked up. "There," she whispered, pointing to a small ventilation shaft near the ground. "I can fit through that." Jake frowned. "It's risky. If they catch you." "They won't," Zira said firmly. "I'm small and fast. I can get in and unlock the door for you." Jake hesitated, but the determination in her eyes convinced him. "All right," he said. "But be careful. If anything goes wrong, you get out of there. Don't try to be a hero." Zira nodded, her heart pounding as she crawled toward the shaft. She squeezed inside, the metal walls pressing against her from all sides. The sound of her breathing echoed in her ears as she moved forward, every muscle tense. Inside the warehouse, Zira found herself in a maze of crates and machinery. The air was thick with the smell of oil and the faint hum of energy fields. She crept silently, her small size allowing her to slip past the guards unnoticed. At last, she reached the control panel near the main door. Her fingers trembled as she worked to override the lock, the glowing buttons casting a faint light on her face. Outside, Jake waited, his eyes fixed on the door. He heard the faint click of the lock disengaging and smiled. "That's my girl." The door slid open, and Jake slipped inside, his movements quick and silent. He found Zira hiding behind a crate, her eyes wide with relief. "Nice work," he whispered. "Now let's see what they're hiding here." The two of them moved through the warehouse, their eyes scanning the labels on the crates. Most of it was standard contraband, illegal weapons, stolen tech, but then they found something that made Zira's heart stop. A crate marked with her brother's name. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, but before she could open it, a voice rang out behind them. "Looks like we got company." Jake and Zira spun around to see a group of armed thugs blocking their path, their weapons trained on the pair. Jake stepped in front of Zira, his expression calm but dangerous. "Well," he said with a smirk, "this just got interesting." The unexpected allies. The cold, dimly lit room echoed with the distant hum of machinery as Jake and Zira sat bound to a pair of metal chairs. Their wrists were secured with glowing restraints, humming faintly with energy. A group of Iron Fang thugs loomed nearby, watching them with smug expressions. The leader of the group, a tall, reptilian alien with golden scales and a cybernetic eye, paced in front of them. "Well, well," the leader hissed, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. "A human and a runt daring to sneak into my warehouse. Bold. Stupid, but bold." Jake tilted his head, his smirk unshaken. "You call this a warehouse? I've seen junkyards with better organization. The leader's cybernetic eye flickered, and he stepped closer to Jake. "You've got a big mouth for someone in your position." "Yeah," Jake replied, shrugging as much as the restraints allowed. "It's kind of a problem. People keep trying to shut it for me, but so far, no one succeeded." The leader growled, his claws flexing. "Maybe I'll be the first." Before the situation could escalate, a loud crash echoed through the room. Everyone turned toward the source of the noise, a side door that had been forced open. A group of ragtag aliens entered, armed with a mix of crude weapons and scavenged tech. Their leader, a burly creature with thick fur and glowing blue eyes, stepped forward. "You're not laying a finger on them," the newcomer growled. The Iron Fang thugs moved to intercept, but the newcomers were faster. Chaos erupted as the two groups clashed, energy bolts flying and shouts echoing off the walls. Jake used the distraction to twist his wrists against the restraints, freeing himself just as one of the newcomers cut Zira's bindings. "Whoa," Zira started to ask, but Jake shook his head. "No time. Stick close to me." As the battle raged, Jake and Zira followed the burly alien leader through the chaos. He led them into a narrow passageway, away from the main fight. Once they were clear, the burly alien turned to face them. "You owe us," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Jake raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Name's Gron," the alien replied. "We're the outcasts, former Iron Fang members who got tired of their lies and cruelty. We've been looking for a chance to strike back, and you two gave us one." Zira's antennae twitched. "Why help us?" "Because you're fighting them," Gron said simply. "And because the Iron Fang doesn't care who they hurt. We've all lost people to them. Family, friends. We can't stand by anymore." Jake nodded, his expression serious. "Well, Gron, I'm not one to turn down help. But we're not just here to fight them. We're looking for someone." "Rin," Zira added quickly. "My brother. They took him." Gron's eyes narrowed. "I've heard the name. He's a mechanic, right? The Iron Fang's been bragging about some genius they've got working for them. They're keeping him close. He's valuable to them." "Where is he?" Zira asked, her voice urgent. Gron hesitated, then sighed. "Their main base. It's heavily guarded, with layers of security. Getting in won't be easy." Jake smirked. "Good thing I like a challenge." The next few hours were spent planning. Gron and his group led Jake and Zira to a hidden hideout, a dimly lit room filled with maps, weapons, and old equipment. Gron pointed to a holographic projection of the Iron Fang's base, a massive compound surrounded by walls, turrets, and patrols. "There's a weakness here," Gron said, pointing to a drainage tunnel. "It's small, but it leads directly into the lower levels. From there, you'll have to fight your way up." Jake studied the map, his expression thoughtful. "We'll need a diversion to draw their attention." Gron nodded. "We can handle that. My people are ready to fight." Zira, who had been quiet during the discussion, suddenly spoke up. "What about Rin? Do we know where he's being held?" Gron tapped a section of the map. "The workshop. It's in the East Wing. That's where they keep all their high-value prisoners." Zira's hands tightened into fists. "Then that's where we'll go." Jake glanced at her, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "You're tougher than you look, kid." Zira met his gaze, her determination unwavering. "I have to be." For Rin, the plan was set. Gron and his outcasts would launch a direct assault on the compound's front gate, creating chaos and drawing the guards away. Meanwhile, Jake and Zira would slip in through the drainage tunnel, navigating the lower levels to reach the workshop. As they prepared for the mission, Jake knelt in front of Zira, his expression serious. "You sure you're ready for this?" Zira nodded, clutching her satchel tightly. "I've come this far. I won't stop now." Jake smiled faintly. "Good answer. Just remember, stick close to me, and don't take unnecessary risks. We're getting your brother out, no matter what." As the sun set, Casting the industrial district in shades of orange and red, the group moved into position. The tension was palpable, every sound magnified in the stillness. Grun's team readied their weapons, while Jake and Zira crouched near the drainage tunnel, waiting for the signal. When the first explosion rocked the air, Zira's heart leaped into her throat. The Iron Fang's alarms blared, and shouts echoed from the compound. Jake turned to her, his green eyes gleaming with determination. "Let's go," he said. Together, they slipped into the darkness of the tunnel, their mission clear and their resolve unshakable. The final showdown. The drainage tunnel was damp and reeked of decay, but Jake and Zira pushed forward in silence, the faint echoes of the Iron Fang's alarms above grounding their urgency. Zira clutched her satchel tightly, the thought of her brother keeping her fear at bay. Jake led the way, his sharp green eyes scanning the dark, twisting path for any sign of traps or patrols. The tunnel opened into a dimly lit corridor deep within the Iron Fang's compound. The sound of muffled voices and heavy machinery reverberated through the walls. Jake crouched low and gestured for Zira to follow. "This is where it gets tricky," Jake whispered. "Stay behind me and keep quiet." Zira nodded, her antennae twitching nervously. Her heart pounded as they crept through the shadowed corridor, moving closer to their destination, the workshop where Rin was being held. As they approached the workshop, Jake held up a hand, signaling Zira to stop. He peered around the corner, spotting two guards standing outside the heavy metal door. Both were armed with energy rifles and appeared alert, their eyes scanning the hallway. Jake leaned back and whispered, "Two guards. Armed. We'll need to take them out quietly." Zira frowned. "How?" "They'll see us coming." Jake smirked and reached into his jacket, pulling out a small cylindrical device. "That's what smoke grenades are for." Before Zira could ask more, Jake activated the grenade and rolled it down the corridor. The device hissed as it released a thick cloud of smoke, engulfing the guards. They shouted in confusion, their weapons firing blindly into the haze. Jake darted forward, moving like a shadow. He struck the first guard with a precise blow to the head, knocking him unconscious. The second guard turned toward the sound, but Jake was faster. He disarmed the guard and delivered a swift kick, sending him sprawling to the floor. Within seconds, the hallway was silent again. Jake gestured for Zira to join him, and she hurried to his side, her heart racing. "You're really good at this," she whispered. Jake grinned. "Let's just say I've had practice." The workshop door was locked, but Zira quickly produced a small tool from her satchel and began working on the panel. Her nimble fingers moved with precision, and within moments, the lock clicked open. Jake glanced at her, impressed. "Looks like your brother isn't the only one who's good with tech." Zira blushed faintly, but said nothing as they pushed the door open. Inside, the workshop was a chaotic mess of machinery, tools, and half-assembled devices. In the center of the room, Rin sat at a workbench, his wrists bound with glowing restraints. He was taller than Zira, but shared her pale green skin and large expressive eyes. His face lit up with shock and relief when he saw her. "Zira?" he said, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here?" "I came to get you," Zira said, rushing to his side. "I'm not leaving without you." Rin shook his head. "You shouldn't have come. It's too dangerous." Jake stepped forward, scanning the room for potential threats. "Danger's kind of our thing. Let's get those cuffs off." Using Zira's tools, Jake quickly freed Rin, who stood and stretched his sore limbs. "Who's your friend?" Rin asked, nodding toward Jake. "Jake," Zira said with a small smile. "He's helping us." "Long story," Jake added. "We can catch up later. Right now, we need to get out of here." Just as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them. A deep, menacing laugh echoed through the room as the Iron Fang leader stepped out of the shadows, flanked by a squad of heavily armed guards. His golden scales gleamed in the harsh workshop lights, and his cybernetic eye glowed ominously. Well, well, the leader hissed, his voice dripping with malice. The little thief, her genius brother, and the human pest. I should have known you'd try something like this. Jake stepped forward, placing himself between the siblings and the leader. You've got a lot of nerve showing your face after what you've done. The leader smirked. And you've got a death wish if you think you can walk out of here alive. The guards raised their weapons, and the tension in the room became suffocating. But before anyone could act, explosions rocked the compound. The walls shook, and the lights flickered as Gron's outcasts launched their final assault. The leader snarled, his cybernetic eye scanning the room. What is this? Jake smirked. Your empire crumbling. Using the distraction, Jake lunged at the leader, engaging him in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. The leader was strong, his cybernetic enhancements giving him an edge, but Jake's speed and experience kept him on equal footing. Meanwhile, Zira and Rin ducked behind the workbench as the guards opened fire. Rin grabbed a discarded energy rifle and handed it to Zira. Can you use this? I'll try, Zira said, her hands trembling as she aimed at one of the guards. She squeezed the trigger, and the blast sent the guard sprawling. Rin grabbed a nearby tool, a heavy wrench, and joined the fight, taking out another guard with a powerful swing. The room was chaos, filled with the sounds of energy blasts, shouts, and the clanging of metal. Jake finally managed to overpower the leader, disarming him and pinning him to the floor. Call them off, Jake growled. The leader sneered, blood dripping from his lip. You think you've won. The Iron Fang doesn't die that easily. Jake smirked. Maybe not, but you'll wish it did. As more explosions shook the compound, the remaining guards retreated, realizing the battle was lost. Gron and his outcasts stormed into the workshop, securing the area. Jake stood, breathing heavily, and looked at Zira and Rin. You two okay? Zira nodded, her eyes shining with relief. We're okay, thanks to you. Jake smiled faintly. Good. Now let's get out of here before the whole place comes down. With Gron's help, they escaped the compound, just as the final explosions brought it crumbling to the ground. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zira and Rin were safe. But the fight wasn't over yet, not completely. The Iron Fang would regroup, and they'd be back. But as Jake looked at the siblings, standing side by side with newfound strength in their eyes, he knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't be facing the future alone. A new beginning. The sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon of the industrial district, painting the ruined Iron Fang compound in hues of orange and gold. Smoke still billowed from the wreckage, the remnants of explosions smudging the sky. Jake, Zira, Rin and Gron stood at a safe distance, watching as the last vestiges of the gang's reign crumbled into dust. Rin turned to his sister, his pale green skin catching the first rays of sunlight. I can't believe we made it, he said, his voice a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. Zira, clutching her satchel tightly, gave a small, tired smile. We made it because we didn't give up. And because of them. She nodded toward Jake and Gron. Jake smirked, leaning casually against a pile of debris. Don't give me too much credit, kid. You did most of the work. Rin looked at Jake, his expression serious. Thank you. For saving Zira. For saving me. Jake shrugged. I just did what anyone should have done. Not everyone would, Zira said softly, her wide eyes filled with gratitude. Most people turned away. Jake didn't reply immediately. His gaze drifted to the distant skyline, where the first signs of a new day hinted at a fresh start. Well, he said finally, maybe it's time that changed. The group made their way back to Gron's hideout, a small but secure bunker hidden beneath the remains of an abandoned factory. Gron's crew, aliens of various shapes and sizes, greeted them with cheers and relief. The outcasts had won their freedom, and for the first time in years, they could imagine a future without fear. Inside the hideout, Gron addressed his crew. The Iron Fang is broken, he announced, his deep voice echoing through the room. They'll try to regroup, but they'll never be as strong as they were. And if they come back, we'll be ready." The crew roared in agreement, their voices filled with newfound confidence. Gron turned to Jake, Zira, and Rin. "You've got a place here, if you want it. We could use fighters like you." Rin hesitated, glancing at his sister. "I don't know. We've been running for so long. Maybe it's time to stop." Zira looked up at him, her antennae twitching thoughtfully. "What about your workshop? You always said you wanted a place where you could build things without anyone telling you what to do." Rin smiled faintly. "Yeah, I did. But I can't just think about myself. What do you want, Zira?" Zira hesitated, then looked at Jake. "What about you? What are you going to do now?" Jake leaned back in his chair, a distant look in his eyes. "I haven't thought that far ahead. I've spent most of my life running from one fight to the next. Maybe it's time to find something worth sticking around for." Zira tilted her head. "You could stay here, help Gron, and the others. They need someone like you." Jake chuckled. "You're not getting rid of me that easily, kid. But this place, it's not where I'm supposed to be." As the day wore on, the group helped clean up the hideout and plan the next steps. Rin began sketching ideas for a new workshop, his excitement growing with each detail. Zira stayed close to him, her presence a constant reminder of what they had fought for. Later that evening, as the stars began to fill the sky, Jake stood outside the hideout, staring up at the constellations. Zira approached him quietly, her small figure almost lost in the shadows. "You're leaving, aren't you?" she asked. Jake nodded. "Yeah, my job's done here. You and your brother are safe, and Gron's got things under control." Zira hesitated, then said, "You could stay, even if just for a little while." Jake smiled faintly. "I appreciate that, but I've got a knack for trouble. If I stick around, it'll find me. And I don't want to bring that on you or your brother." Zira's large eyes glistened, and she looked down at her feet. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Jake said gently. "By not giving up. By being brave. You've got more fight in you than most people twice your size." She looked up at him, her expression a mix of sadness and determination. "Will I ever see you again?" Jake's smirk returned. "Who knows? The galaxy's a big place, but it has a funny way of bringing people back together." The next morning, Jake prepared to leave. Gron and his crew gathered to see him off, their gratitude clear in their eyes. Rin shook his hand firmly. "If you ever need a place to lay low, you know where to find us." "I'll keep that in mind," Jake replied. Zira stood a few steps away, clutching her satchel. As Jake turned to leave, she suddenly rushed forward and hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled against his jacket. Jake froze for a moment, then gently patted her head. "Take care of yourself, kid, and don't let anyone push you around." She stepped back, wiping her eyes as he walked away, his figure growing smaller against the endless horizon. As Jake disappeared into the distance, Zira and Rin stood together, watching him go. The weight of their journey lingered, but so did the hope for a brighter future. They had faced the darkness and come out stronger. And somewhere out there, Jake moved on to his next adventure. A lone human in a galaxy filled with danger and wonder, carrying the unshakable belief that sometimes one person could make all the difference.